And that I had this conversation with a couple of pastors by Zoom, and we invited Nikki to join us. And she thought it might be a conversation worth elevating during Women's Advocacy Month because we share the commitment, as she was saying, that thriving, safety is foundational for thriving, right? Like if you don't feel safe and you are not safe, it's really, really hard to thrive, right? You got to get off of the bottom of Maslow's pyramid to really begin to thrive, right? And that's where safety comes in. And so we wanted to have this conversation, and I really want it to be a conversation. Like I've got some things I'll share with you. Some of you have heard them already, probably. Um, but I want to address things that if you have particular concerns or you have particular issues that you are, that you're considering or concerned about in your context, I definitely want to know that, right? Because here's the disclaimer. I'm an expert on church because I've done church forever and ever. I am informed on safety and security. I'm working toward expertise on safety and security. So, what I'm going to share with you comes out of learning for me from trusted organizations and trusted people. Um, and it is reliable and evidence informed, but there are experts in your community that can support you too, right? Um, and so I want you to there's a good chance I'll say I can't answer that or I don't know or here's some places to go to find the answer. Um, because I don't want you to feel vulnerable or in fact be vulnerable to ideological violence. So what are we talking about with ideological violence? Well, we're talking about somebody acting up either, physically or verbally or acting in a way that is disruptive to your congregation because of something they believe or they believe about you, right? Um, that's ideological violence, and it can be psychological violence and emotional violence as well as physical violence. And the kinds of things we've seen in CBF life are people interrupting worship services, people um, picketing and raising their voice from the sidewalks and harassing people who are going into church because they have a female pastor. We've seen people come into church space and harangue church members for having a female pastor. And all of those are experienced as violence, even though they were not necessarily, um, somebody laying hands on somebody else. Um, and so, what I'm going to offer you today is some ways to think about how to categorize, understand, and respond well to exactly that kind of experience. Okay. So feel free to put questions in the chat. If you have some, if you have some early questions or some early things that you're concerned about, like if you brought to this conversation a question you really hoped was answered, I'd really love to hear that. Like you can speak it now, or you can put it in the chat, or you can save it to the end. But um, you're experts in your own context, and all safety and security is contextual, right? Like I can kind of give you some ways to think about and approach, but it all lives where you are. And so if you have particular contextual questions or concerns that you want to bring up, we can talk about those as well. Um, so so if that sounds okay, I'll share my screen and we can go from there. All right, thank you. All right. Three, two, one. Here we go. I trust that you can see that. Um, we're church folk. It helps to start with a theological foundation for what we do. Um, and part of our theological framework for safety and security is, as we walk through Lent toward Easter, a conviction about the power of God to bring life and to bring ultimate security, right? The Psalms are full of the confession, God is our rock and our fortress and our refuge, our protector. Um, we know from Easter that even if the worst possible thing happens to us, that's not the last word over us. right? That God redeems and brings life. So our ultimate security is not in question, but we're balancing, a commitment to be open to the world with the need to be safe as well, right? So even though ultimately we are in fact secure, we're living in the penultimate moment of, right now. And so we balance that openness with a duty to care for the folks who come toward us, right? If we're going to invite people into our space, if we're going to enact public worship, um, we have a commitment to keep people safe if we can. And so that those are the sort of the twin lenses through which I think about safety and security for church from a theological starting point. Um, there let me frame this a little bit, and that's supposed to be 2025 because I just updated this slide. But um, violence at church is exceedingly rare, and that's a really great thing, right? And so I think it's important for us to frame this um, from common experience too. It's much more likely somebody's going to have a health emergency than to experience a violent crime at church. It's even more likely that someone would experience child sexual abuse in a congregational context than um, homicidal violence or criminal violence. But having said that, over the last 25 years, there have been nearly 400 violent incidences in houses of worship. So that includes Christian churches, synagogues, and masjids or Islamic centers. And of those 400 incidences, we can attribute some kind of understanding of what brought it about. Um, in a good portion of those, from public reporting, from criminal reports, the Violence Project at Hamline University tracks this and other kinds of violence really closely and carefully. They're a very good source. Um, and so they've identified about 23% of those homicides of 500 people over 25 years were attributable to domestic violence or to a dispute that happened in the congregation and escalated, or robbery or mental health related. And about 5% were related to ideological violence, far as we can tell. Um, Now, the context of the last 25 years is slightly different than the context of this year, right? Like the world is a more violent place. People feel more empowered to act on um, out of their ideology and to confront others. It's become a part of our discourse over the last 5 or 6 years. Um, so that number may change over time, but historically, it's been a low percentage of the violence that has come to church. It's important to note that about a quarter of the violence happens on Sunday. So while that says a few things to us, right? Um, if 25% happens on Sunday, then the other 6 days have the other 75%. So we have to pay attention not just to Sunday, but to how we are coming and going and how we are securing our spaces throughout the week. But the predominance is going to be on Sunday when the facility is open to the public, right? Um, the 12% of times when violence occurred at churches and it was not open to the public is when somebody interrupted a robbery or something like that, right? So So part of what that tells us is we need to pay attention all the time to how we organize our safety and security, but we need to pay particular attention to those times when we're inviting the public into our space and when masses are gathered. About 63%, this is the second column there, of perpetrators were most likely known to the church already. Church members, family members, friends, employees, somebody who is close in the neighborhood and probably on the property a lot. So that tells us that paying attention to our folks and to the experiences of the lives of our people, like churches are places where people share their burdens and they share their experiences. And so if people are sharing with us experiences that cause us concern related to violence, we should probably pay attention to that and lean in, because we have a chance of preventing violence because we know the folks are ready. And we're going to talk a bit about kind of what that looks like here in a second. Um, Ideological violence is going to be a little bit more tricky, and it's going to fall through some of the cracks of not knowing, right? Because if somebody decides that they are going to act up because they identify your congregation as one that is out of step with how they think the world ought to be, or church ought to be, or whatever, you may not know that until they get there. Um, but we'll talk about some ways where you can be sensitive and maybe pick up ahead of time, right? So really, the prevention of violence generally invites us into great care for our people, which y'all are going to lean into anyway, right? And the rest comes from paying attention in our spaces and to the world around us. So behavioral threat assessment is a discipline that emerged in the early 90s. So the Los Angeles Police Department um, was dealing with violence towards celebrities from stalkers. And so they formed some units to pay particular attention to people who were enacting targeted violence against known figures, right? And so they started paying attention in new ways to the threats people made, to how stalkers behaved. And after Columbine, the shooting at Columbine High School in 1999, um, what it started in paying attention to stalking began to pay attention to other forms of targeted violence. And so behavioral threat assessment lives at this intersection between forensic science, so forensic psychology, so the dealing with sort of criminal intent and violent behavior, and criminology, the behavior that leads up to violent acts. Um, and behavioral threat assessment has been able to describe um, a very common pathway to violence. This is the typical journey somebody moves through from a grievance, some wrong that they perceive existing, to enacting violence that they imagine will somehow satisfy that grievance, right? And so it starts with a grievance that could be, something real. They came by for help and you weren't able to help them, and so now they're mad at you. It could be something that they just perceive, right? This church has a female pastor, and I don't think there should be female pastors. And so, that's the grievance. Ideation is when that person begins to imagine that violence is justified in relation to that grievance. So they begin to see a violent act as a way to satisfy the wrong in the grievance, get retribution, whatever it is that they're worried about or acting on. And then they move to research. They work to understand how they can move into a violent posture and carry out this attack. And that could be research about methods and means. It could be research about the church, the person, whoever their target is. And so those first three steps are actions of thought, right? They're difficult to perceive if you're not in the immediate space of that person. If you don't see them Googling how to do whatever, right? But the next three steps move into actions. So once a person has decided that violence is the solution and has chosen the violence they will enact, then they typically move through these actions. Preparation, so acquiring skills or resources. You can be gathering materials, you can be getting guns, you can be, buying whatever is necessary. It could be if they're planning a car ramming attack, right? Getting the right kind of car, um, planning for their approach, just those kinds of things. So gathering the resources necessary, that could include writing a manifesto, or for some, it comes with suicidal ideation. And so that can be preparing for the end, right? So giving away prized possessions, making sure pets are cared for, that kind of stuff. Then a breach. So occasionally, typically, the time of the attack is not the first time a person comes to where the attack will happen. So they test. Can I get in? Will I be stopped? Will people notice me? Will I be engaged? And so they'll breach first and then perform the attack. Sometimes breach and attack can be very close together. Sometimes they can be separated by days or even weeks, right? Um, but these actions are visible. So for most people, someone will see them buying guns or acquiring skill or buying ammunition or preparing in some way. Um, Someone may be observed as they breach a property, driving into the church parking lot, driving in at weird times, sitting at the back of the parking lot, observing people, right? Testing a boundary, you can be observed. And then, of course, the attack is an action too. And so, if we're able to engage people's thoughts, this is where, domestic violence, um, workplace violence, stalking, these are kinds of things where if we know a situation, we may be able to know what somebody is thinking and intersect them and redirect them, address the grievance, get them some support. Once they start moving to actions, tends things to speed up. Um, and so if we observe these other behaviors now, really it's a 911 call, right? Now we are really concerned that this person is moving toward violence. This is a slightly different way to express pretty well the same thing. Um, Targeted violence, mass violence, we're paying attention to behavior. So the yellow at the top, like 11 to 1 there, um, we sometimes see deepening depression and despair or other changes in behavior, cutting people off, acting erratic, um, changing their routines, um, loss of job, quitting a job, that precipitate changes in behavior like that. And so that really means somebody needs support. They need care if that's what we observe. The orange, much more concerning now because now there's preparatory behavior that can be observed. Interest in past attacks is very notable. So this is especially true for like school shooters or for some mass people who enact mass violence. They'll research prior school shooters, or they'll research people who um, who enacted targeted violence in order to gain notoriety or to identify with them as a way of elevating their own stature or cause. So if we encounter somebody who's talking about past attacks or focused on earlier acts of violence, that's a huge red flag for us. Fixation can look like getting an email from somebody every day, all the time, right? Or it can be every time you talk to this person, the same topic comes up, right? We started talking about baseball and it always ends with a rant against illegal immigrants or something, right? A fixation. Um, we've talked some about weapons already. Novel violence or aggression can be picking a fight, harming an animal, doing something that is violent to prove to themselves they can be violent. Um, and so if somebody has a first instance of violence like that, and you've observed those other changes in them, then that's a real cause for concern, and they need some support um, and help. When you get to the red ones, these are now times to call the police, right? The other things are going to worry us. We're going to think about how we can intersect this person's life with some support. Um, but if we see or hear an expressed or implied threat, then we take that seriously. We make sure authorities know about that. If they directly communicate a threat, I'm going to. If you don't, I will. These are also times to alert the local authorities, make sure they are aware of this person's intent to violence. If we experience end of life planning, if somebody expresses suicidality, that's of course they need help, right? But suicidality often accompanies homicidality. And so if somebody has decided that they will can kill themselves, nobody else's life is as valuable as my own, right? So it's a short trip from suicidality to homicidality. And so if somebody's expressing suicidality, they both need support, but we also need to pay attention to the people around them to harm. Um, so back to the pathway to violence. Um, for ideal, the way to prevent targeted violence is to work to deter um, the idea of violence being the solution, right? So that's positive messaging, that's offers of help and support, that's, heading off um, the fixation, helping to redirect, right? And this typically happens either in a clinical setting or from people who are really close to a person who is considering violence. Um, this can be at times, for like domestic violence, this can be offender programs where they learn anger management skills and things that can deter moving from grievance to imagining violence as a solution. For ideological violence, that's really hard because who knows? Like, unless they are expressing it publicly, who knows that they're considering violence, right? So it's really difficult to deter, except for the sort of environmental things, just the general um, societal discouragement of targeted violence. As you move from thought toward action, though, on the pathway to violence, prevention relies now on detection. So the way to prevent targeted violence is to detect when someone is about to enact that violence, when they show up in the new place, right? When they've expressed something on social media that is an intent to harm. It can be security personnel when they see somebody they don't know, or greeters and ushers when they see somebody they don't know and they're approaching in a way that makes them stand out from, regular people going to church. It can be cameras if we monitor them, right? So detection is how do we see when this person is moving toward violence and how do we head them off so that they can't get there? And then finally, mitigation. How do we disrupt the success of an attack or limit it? And that's the immediate response once an attack begins. And so if it is a bullhorn attack, right? If somebody's standing on the sidewalk with a bullhorn and berating people, um, disruption of that success could be just getting everybody inside, and that's our plan. Is just get everybody inside. We call the authorities to make sure everybody's safe, and if this person can be trespassed or moved along, then that's what happens, right? But as the attack happens, that's really the last chance to mitigate or to stop what's going on. So the the pattern um, for planning for safety and security and we'll dial this in for ideological violence, but this is kind of the bigger overview, is to create an emergency action plan that's based on these 5 steps: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Um, so what does that mean? Well, we identify what the threat is and how vulnerable we might be to it, right? Um, if, for example, I'm going to stick with the bullhorn attack. If we identify a, a protest attack as um, as the threat we want to address, then we define it there. Somebody on our property raising their voice, disrupting our event, preventing our people from feeling safe as they come in, right? So protect is what we can do ahead of time to um, prevent that kind of attack from happening, right? So our plan to protect could be we tell everybody at church, if this ever happens, here's what you do. You stay in your car and wait for further instructions. Or maybe you go into the entrance farthest from where that person is, but then everybody comes inside, right? It can be whatever kind of plan makes sense for your context. It might be that we plant holly bushes around the perimeter of the church property so that somebody couldn't see in. If they tried to come through, it'd be real pokey, right? Like there's we start to imagine things that we can do ahead of time to protect against that kind of attack. And then we talk about how we will know if this is happening. If somebody comes with the intent to raise their voice, to disrupt our service, to prevent our people from coming into church, how are we going to know that? And how are we going to let people know we know that, right? So here's a communication plan. Here is, okay, we're going to have so many greeters, and if they see this experience, they're going to tell whoever they're going to tell, who is going to spread the word. This is happening, take this plan, right? And that's going to kick off our detection, will kick off our response plan. Our response is everybody comes inside, we call the police. We have 2 greeters who stand at the door, making sure people can get in, but the door is locked, right? Like whatever this response plan is, this is where it is enacted. And then there's a recovery plan. After the threat has passed, once this person is gone, um, then what do we need to do to care for our people, to make sure everybody's all right, to be sure they can get back to their car and they can get home safe and they can come back next week, right? And so recovery should always be a part of that kind of emergency action plan. So you can take this pattern of 5: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and you can apply it to lots of kinds of threats you might experience at a church, right? Like this is a good practice generally, to have for severe weather and fire, generally threatening behavior, right? Somebody is just there and they're mad and they're pitching a fit. How are we going to respond to that? To mental health crisis, accident, injury, health emergency, um, active assailant, bomb threat. I've had a couple of churches in CBF life who have received bomb threats in the last couple of years because of their ideology. Bullhorn attack or protesting, or if a security breach generally. Like if you're the first person to get to church on Tuesday morning and you notice that a door is left open a little bit, what's your plan? Right? Like you're just going to go in? Are you going to call somebody to go in with you? If you notice a lock is broken or a window is broken or there's been some graffiti on the church or vandalism, what's your plan for that too? Because those can be precursors for other kinds of violent acts. Like remember, some of those church homicides were interruptions of robbery, right? So we never want you just going into a building if you suspect somebody has gone in there. So you can work that. You see IPDRR, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. You can work that pattern with any of these kinds of issues for church and share those plans with your church, right? Like if you have annual or quarterly business meetings, just pick one, right? This is something we're doing to keep you safe. hey, remember, this is our plan if there's a fire. This is our plan if somebody has a mental health crisis. This is our plan, right? Just so that the people who are involved in response are reminded of what their role is, and so that others will know there is a plan. Um, a story I tell sometimes is I was pastor to a volunteer fire chief. Great guy, very vigilant with his volunteer fire department. And we were at an event at an elementary school for parents. And the fire alarm went off in the middle of this event. It was like an open house, so there's just a bunch of people milling around. The fire alarm went off and nobody moved. Um, and I have to say, that is the angriest I have ever seen a human when there was not a fist fight that followed it. Because he was like, you get these kids out of here. Like, you don't know if there's a fire or not. This alarm means something. Get out. And if the alarm had gone off during the day when elementary school was in session, those kids would have known exactly what to do because they would have practiced that, right? But because it was adults and because we didn't practice the plan and the kids were taking our cues, right? We all knew it was a fire alarm, but we didn't understand how we were supposed to respond in that moment, right? So having a plan is great. Sharing the plan is critical, right? We don't want it to be data. We want it to be a plan. All right. Um, so let's think a little bit about ideological violence then. What would an emergency action plan for ideological violence look like? Well, we would identify what that threat is. Somebody entering the property to disrupt or act violently based on opposition to female clergy or queer inclusion or whatever the ideological factor could be, right? So we identify what the threat is, disruption and violence. And then we think, what can we do ahead of time in our context? What kind of plans do we need? What kind of advanced actions do we need to to protect against this kind of attack? Well, you can think in terms of discover, deny, delay, defend. What can we do ahead of time to discover if somebody is going to do this kind of violence? So how will we know if somebody intends to act up? How do we create lead time for a response? Well, social media monitoring. You know, you may have somebody who posts social media for your church. Have them also set up alerts. So if somebody is mentioning your church on social media, you know it, right? Pay attention to Facebook comments. Have some Tums handy and, you know, steel yourself against lunacy. But, pay attention to what people are saying when you post things online. Um, Set up Google alerts for your community and the neighborhood around your church so that you know if people are talking about your area or your church. You can plan ahead how to deny entry if you discover somebody is acting up, right? So, what's our plan for locking the doors? That's part of our protection. What's our plan for shutting the gates to the church parking lot or making sure all the doors are secure? How can we deny somebody entry if they show up in this threatening way? Because we need to have that prepared ahead of time. That's why that's part of protection, right? The we have we have to know how to lock the door, and somebody has to be there to do it. Um, Delay. How can we increase the time it takes for somebody to breach the building in order to act up? Again, we lock the door, we get people behind another locked door. If somebody shows up complaining about our female pastor, part of delay is getting that female pastor behind another locked door. Where in the office, where in the church, where is safe space if she is the target? What kind of plan do we need to defend? What is our response to the attack, or to violence? So if somebody stands up in the middle of worship and starts shouting Jezebel, what's our response to that? Are we going to put hands on somebody? Are we going to call 911? Are we going to pray? Are we just going to silently leave them standing there by themselves? Like all of those are good options, maybe, right? What suits our church? What suits our context? What can our people pull off? Um, in most jurisdictions, most states, it's against the law to disrupt a religious service. So, if you know that, if you have extra duty law enforcement or people who are law enforcement in your congregation, they can cite someone or trespass them, right? Like you have a range of responses in defense. What suits y'all? What makes sense for your context? What's going to be the easiest to pull off, right? Realistically for you. Um, then once you kind of have a protection plan, you can then think about how will we know to enact this plan? How will we detect when somebody comes to our church with bad intentions? We're going to talk about that on the next slide, a bit more deeply, but you know, you need a mechanism for detection and alert. Who's going to see and then who needs to know so that your response plan of deny, delay, defend can begin, right? Like you don't know when to start your response until you detect, and then you can recover. Um, Probably will require some counseling care and trauma care. Um, Probably will take some explaining and maybe some media management, right? Depending on the kind of attack and how significant it was and how people responded. And then it's really important as a part of recovery to think about what would we do different next time. Um, so this detection, how do we know when somebody is coming into our space in order to act violently? Um, well, I invite you to think about your property and your context in a series of concentric circles. And that outer circle, that outer perimeter are the edges of your property. Um, where the public roads or the public rights of way or the sidewalks meet the church property. And to pay attention at that outer perimeter for the ways that people can come onto your space and leave your space. Um, where can they come in and be seen, but where can they come in and not be seen? And what do you need to do to make sure that if there's an area where somebody can come onto the property and not be observed, we can either prevent access there or see it. Um, and then you need to have people who are able to observe that outer perimeter on Sunday morning and maybe at other times when you're active, but for sure on Sunday morning. Um, Partly because that outer perimeter is where most bad stuff happens, right? Like 80% of church attacks are in the parking lot. And so if nobody is there to see, then it delays response and it delays recovery. And so rather than just having greeters at your door, consider having people out in the space, out in the parking lot, or at least where they can see to the outer edges of the property and see where somebody comes on. Because that's also where somebody's going to trip and fall. Um, that's where, a stroller is going to start rolling away from a parent trying to get five kids out of the van, right? Like that's where somebody's going to need some help. And so if you have people out there observing, it's just safer generally, but it's also going to be safer from a security kind of perspective. The middle perimeter is the outer shell of your building and how people come into it. So it's the doors and the windows and the egress and ingress. And so you need to think about how you can secure your outer perimeter. Are there gates we can close? Are there fences? Whatever. But you also need to know how you secure your middle perimeter. What doors are locked? What doors are unlocked? Is somebody checking the windows and making sure all the windows are closed and locked? Are there places where people can get in and not be observed? Because we want everybody to be seen. That's how we hold behavior accountable. That's how we protect against bad behavior, is we're able to observe it. And so that middle perimeter is where you secure your doors. If you see something in the outer perimeter, if somebody comes onto the property and it's August and they're wearing a long, heavy coat, maybe you want somebody to see that and say, hey, let's lock the door or make sure somebody is slowed down as they come in. Like this, that's unusual. We need to be able to engage them. We'll talk about that in a second. But so that middle perimeter is keeping people out of the building. And how do we pay attention to that? And how do we do it if we have to? Then the inner perimeter is where inside the church can we secure? Is the office lockable? Are there other places that we can go and lock somebody in to, again, deny and delay are two parts of security. And so having somewhere inside that we can lock people in um, gives us more ability to deny and delay. So across all three perimeters, you really want people just paying attention to the environment, paying attention to who's coming and going, paying attention to who needs help, paying attention to what's locked and what's unlocked. And one way to do that is to kind of train your folks in a concept called the power of hello. And it's going to sound so simple when I say it, and really it is. Um, it's just having people at each perimeter who say, hey, I'm glad you're here. How can I help you find? If it's somebody you don't know, hey, I'm Jay. So glad you're here. Where are you headed? How can I help you get there? Because that little interaction gives you a great read on somebody's intention, right? If they're coming and their response to a kind greeting is gruff and grumpy, well, that gives you some indication of their mindset. And maybe that's somebody you want to respond to in a way with care and support, or maybe it's somebody you want to head off before they get in the building, right? Um, if somebody in the outer perimeter sees somebody running through the parking lot, well, maybe that's just somebody's late for Sunday school. Maybe it's somebody trying to get in the building fast. But it's somebody out there whose purpose is to greet in that outer perimeter and see if they need help, if they need support, or if they need to be, welcomed or prevented. And this doesn't have to be a personal engagement or a close engagement, right? As long as somebody can communicate, they can size somebody up from a distance away, um, size up if they are um, acting up or acting out or having a mental health crisis or not engaging with people around them or seem intent. Like we can tell when somebody is angry or when somebody is coming um, without good intentions toward us, right? Like humans are really great at that. Um, but if there's nobody out there to see, and if they don't have a plan to respond when they do see, that's when, we're much more vulnerable to any kind of attack, including ideological. So we want to think about each of those perimeters. How vulnerable are we in those places? What can we do to shore them up, to slow people down, to deny if we need to, and to see who is coming towards us so that we can respond appropriately? Um, And so, create a plan, think about the plan, what are the roles and responsibilities for each part of the plan, and then try it out. Like, does it actually work on Sunday morning? What you intend to do? Can you really get to whatever door is unlocked in order to lock it at the right time? Can you communicate in a way that is meaningful and helpful and fast enough to do what your plan calls you to do? And so then you can review the plan, you can make it better. Um, and it's really useful to involve local relationships in this, right? Like, I know that police departments have varying degrees of professionalism and the ability to respond. And there's certainly been all kinds of problems in policing. But if you invite someone from your local department to come and to talk about your plan with you and to see your property, if they have to respond, that's going to make it a lot easier for them and a lot safer for you. And so, like, I'm sensitive to um I'm sensitive to all the problems with policing, right? Like, it's not a neutral thing in a lot of communities. Um, but there are professionals who will be willing to support your church if you invite them into that space. Same is true of um, other emergency responses, so local emergency management folks and firefighters. I wouldn't invite the fire department in unless you're willing to make changes that they observe because, fire marshals are fire marshals, right? They do things. Um, but it can be really helpful for safety and for preventing somebody from coming in and acting violently. I put my email in the chat already. That's my cell number. I'm easy to find. I'm in the middle of the CBF page that rings in my pocket. I don't really have an office phone. Um, I'm more than happy to talk about contextual questions or to answer things for you or to zoom in with the safety security team and talk through these kinds of things or talk through creating an emergency action plan. Um, and yeah, so I'm gonna stop sharing and I would love to hear from you or questions or things to clarify. That was maybe a little more general than ideological violence exclusively. But a lot of the same things apply. So feel free to unmute yourself if you want to talk.
Tracy Hartman asked in the chat if you're willing to share these slides with us.
Yes.
And he,
Yes. I'm gonna send them to Nikki. I'm gonna put a couple of resources. I'm gonna put a couple of resources there. I put a link in the chat to a book. It's this book, Crime Prevention for Houses of Worship. It's silly expensive. It's like $70, but it's produced by an author with ACES, which is a global security organization that is a professional certifying group, right? So like they they create the standards. Um, I have some standards here somewhere. They create the standards for safety and security across the world. And so their information is really reliable and important.
I will send the slides along with the recording to everyone who registered. But if you have questions, please feel free to ask them now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you
yeah.
don't want to talk, you can put it in the chat and I'll say it, or you can just unmute and talk. We're small enough to do that.
Yes, we uh I was surprised to learn and thrilled to learn that disrupting a religious service is a misdemeanor pretty much across the country these days. And ironically, for some of us, it was in relation to the what was that crazy church that protested all the funerals?
Oh,
West
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 West something, Westboro.
Westboro.
Camille got
Thank you,
it.
Camille. Yeah, yeah, because they were protesting funerals, and the way the laws were written in response to them was like any religious service. And um, so yeah, it's actually pretty handy. Because somebody, if they already have some legal trouble, additional legal trouble is a huge deterrence. If their intention is not physical violence, but just to be a pain, that's a good deterrence for them. Um, yeah. I really hate that women experience ideological violence from time to time and experience these kinds of reactions and protests. And it's happened in CBF life. It's happened in other church. Like there was a group of folks in Atlanta going around to various churches recently. um and one of the things that I always say to safety teams at churches, I think I always say it, I always intend to say it, um is like, if you have women on staff, listen to them. If they have a concern about a time when they're there, or something they've observed or experience they've had, listen to that and address it. Because um, women tend to be much more tuned in to their physical environs in response to safety things. And I will sometimes do a thought experiment with them, which is, when was the last time one of you guys came out of a grocery store and either stayed on the sidewalk or went back in because of something you saw in the parking lot? And they never say anybody. But if I were to ask a group of women that, often many of them will say, yeah, I came out, I saw a guy, he was looking weird, I went back in, right? And so I always encourage churches to have women on their safety and security team for a few reasons. One is that one, right? Like you're paying attention in different ways in common spaces, but also because of the power of hello. Showing up in a space in a female body can be less intimidating and de-escalating from a distance, and when it's safe, like, not talking about breaking up fights, but if somebody comes having had a hard experience or is having a mental health crisis, somebody who is physically smaller or who has a softer voice, who's interacting with them not in an aggressive way, it can just land so much better and different and be so effective. Um, I think it's critical. It changes the flavor and tenor and the gung-ho-ness of a safety and security team to really include lots of different people on it, is what I'm trying to say. Um,
Jay,
yeah.
um, nobody's asked questions yet, so I'm gonna talk slow in case somebody wants to raise their hand now. And I'm not stopping us, but I was gonna
Yeah, of course.
propose a thought. When we had this last time, you had a good conversation with the group on the webinar about how to make decisions about guns. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something that would be interesting to people, but I found it helpful.
Okay.
Sorry, maybe I should have told you that before.
No, it's fine. I'm used to
Beforehand.
answering this question.
Okay. Yeah.
Because, CBF is a broad group of people.
Mhm.
Most of our churches include a variety of ideas about the propriety of carrying a firearm all the time and to church. And there's a couple of considerations. Some states include or exclude churches from places that are automatically um, regulated related to concealed carry. Like some churches, some states say a church must explicitly give permission for people to legally carry. Some say churches must exclude if they don't want people to carry. Some don't say anything about churches. So it's important to understand what your state asks of you. And somebody who is a concealed carrier ought to know that, right? That's part of the responsibility. Second, um, church insurance often dictates how they will respond to people with firearms in your church. So some insurance coverage excludes people who are not explicitly given permission by the church to carry. So if they discharge negligently, accidentally, if somebody gets hurt, the insurance company won't cover somebody who has not gotten permission from the church to carry. That's important for people to know, right? Because it can be financially ruinous to a congregation and a heavy responsibility for somebody to carry. So, if churches are having a conversation about concealed carry, they should ask that if people, they should determine if they will allow it, right? And then if they do allow it, they might need to say who can and give permission explicitly. And then they need to be sure those people have personal liability insurance related to carrying a firearm or a weapon of any kind that will cover them and protect the church if that's where they're going to carry. And then they need to be sure that those people are qualifying for firearm use under time pressure and under stress. It's one thing to be able to shoot a paper target that ain't moving when you're not moving. It's a whole other thing to be able to differentiate shoot or don't shoot targets while you're moving, while you're under stress. And if somebody is not practicing and qualified under stress, they're going to be more dangerous than they're going to be helpful, most likely. Right. And so, like, we know even law enforcement, because they're the tendency is to start shooting as you're drawing. That's why their hit rate is like 30% of what they're shooting at. And so, and they train all the time and they qualify under stress. And so, if we're going to allow people to carry in our churches, then I feel like we should have several barriers to cross to ensure that we are going to be as safe and responsible as possible in order to allow that. And if we can't cross any of those, when we get to the ones we can't cross, then that should be where we draw the line, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Is that what you were thinking about, Nikki?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There were things that I had not known to think about.
Yeah.
And so I felt it, I found it really helpful.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to sort of those levels in the deter, detect, mitigation. Um, how do we as leadership, particularly male leadership, deal with someone at sort of that early stage, the more the like microaggression, because I mean,
Yeah.
I've had situations where people come and complain about another staff member or another person, and it's obvious that it's about their gender. Like, well, what's a good way to enter into that conversation with them?
Yeah. Sometimes people need to be encouraged to find places that match them ideologically, right? Like, there's no shame in saying, you know, we really love Susan. She's an amazing pastor, and maybe she's not right to be your pastor, and that's okay. Let me help you find a great spot, right? Like, to just really de-escalate that. Now, they're probably there because all their family's there and they've been there a million years, and you've taken my church away from me,
Mhm.
right? Like, I get that. Um, in that case, so the way to prevent targeted violence, a way, part of the formula, there's no absolutes here. It's potential targeted violence and possibly preventing it, right? But with all the caveats, is you can address the the person of concern, the subject of the violence, and you can address the target of the violence. So for the subject of the violence, the person who is tending toward violence, you can you can think about the things in their life that are inhibiting factors for them to act violently, right? So they're complaining to you, Jonathan. I don't think Susan should be a pastor. Well, have you talked to your Aunt Margaret about that? Because when your Uncle Henry died, she found Susan to be a really great pastor. So maybe talk to Margaret and see if that changes how you think at all. Or, um, so you've been in leadership here for a long time, and I'm sorry you have this. We want you to stay in leadership. So, if you can't come around, maybe you need to give up your leadership position. And so, like, to identify the things that they value that can then balance out their grievance, right? That can help mitigate or lower their grievance is one way of approaching that. If they cannot be managed, right? Like if they cannot be isolated, removed, changed, then we protect Pastor Susan. This person never gets around her. Like if he's headed over to have a conversation, somebody is always stepping in, right? Like we really manage the the environment around the target, so that they are kept apart. Um, and we talk about we manage the target kind of that way. Keep this person away from Pastor Susan, and we manage the environment. We talk we talk about what our policies are. We talk about the ways we want to treat each other and the standards we're going to hold each other to. And we're going to make it clear that if you cross the boundaries of this behavior, then you can't be a part of this community anymore, right? And then we're going to hold them to that, right? So we can take kind of that three-pronged approach. Best case scenario, we're able to mitigate subject, the person who has the grievance, um, so that we don't have to adjust everybody else's behavior because of this person's bad behavior. Like that's awful. And usually I would not say to do that. But if they're going to be violent, then we kind of have to. Does that help? Lots of words from Jay today.
Are there any other questions? Oh, Luann, it looked like you were about to speak.
Come
Yeah.
on, Luann.
Yay. Are you going to house, I know you're going to share this video with us, but is it going to be housed on the BWIM website?
It will at least end up on our YouTube page.
Oh, okay.
And we're starting to amass lots of resources that we think
Okay.
should be available. And so we're actually talking to our web people right now about the best way to do that.
Okay.
So I don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but it's something we're working to figure out how to organize and present. But you will be able to find it on our YouTube channel.
Oh, that's helpful because just thinking about how to share and because this
Sure.
has been great. So thank
Yeah.
you so much for having this. And Jay, thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Sexual harassment. Yes, we can talk about preventing sexual harassment. Um, it is yes.
Have you
Some of the
solved
same
it?
things apply.
Have you
Yeah.
figured it out?
Have you figured it out?
Tell me if you figured it out. I would love to learn about this.
I mean, for me, I think it is changing the community conversations around what is acceptable behavior with one another, right?
Mhm.
So that everybody's playing by the same rules at the same time and normalizing calling people back into boundaries when they cross them, right? So um, it is saying, look, here are the parameters of our relationship. We're going to read First Corinthians 13 because that was about church people getting along, right? And then we're going to
Mhm.
talk about what it means to be patient and kind and all the other things. And that's going to include how we talk to one another about bodies and clothes and appearance. And it's going to include expectations around touch. And it's going to include obtaining consent. And then it's going to include consensual touch should should also be safe touch, right? It should match the relationship that we have with one another, right?
Mhm.
And we're going to say that, and then we're going to say it again, and we're going to keep saying it, and we're going to talk about it when it comes up, and we're going to normalize, we're going to examine our church culture for where there's entitled behavior, and we're going to make sure that that gets rooted out. So Deacon McHansey, who's at the door to the sanctuary, the same door every Sunday, and all the women know to avoid it, except the poor visitors who come in, right? He loses his position as deacon at the door, right? And we just have to have the fortitude to do that, right? And to examine where entitlement shows up so that we could correct it and cultivate consent and make sure people feel safe. And and then once we tackle that, like once we get sexual harassment handled, right? Because we're going to be a community that doesn't do that. Then we're going to talk about trauma informed ministry, and we're going to talk about all the ways people need to be safe. And you're going to invite Jonathan to your congregation to give a seminar after he finishes his DMin, because that's what he's working on. Um, to talk about trauma informed ministry, like safety and empowerment, voice and choice, and peer support, and transparency. And we're going to talk about history and culture and gender, and we're going to make sure that those are handled well in our environment so that when people come to us, they are safe and they feel safe, right? Like it's not one or the other. It has to be both, or it's not safe.
Mhm.
But I don't have that handbook yet, Camille. Maybe I should write it. One at a time.
What else?
I do think, like, my dream for the church, is that we just normalize all these kinds of conversations about safety. That instead of being rare and responsive conversations, they're common, right? Uh, hey, at the end of worship today, we're going to have a fire drill. And so here's what you do. And your children will be taken out to the safe place and you'll meet them over here, right? And so then we have a fire drill and we have a church picnic outside, right? And this is just what we do every second Sunday after Easter or Pentecost. I don't know. That's a good fire Sunday, right? Um, that every time we have a church conference, when we've given the finance report and we've given the mission report, we also say, here are 3 things your church does to keep you safe. We have this abuse prevention policy, and this is how it applies to kids and adults and everybody else. And we have a safety and security team, and they have a plan for this or that, and this is how it works, right? Um, and then in the church newsletter, once in a while, it says, hey, remember, set your clock back and check your fire alarm. And here's what we do to make sure if you have a heart attack at church, somebody's going to come and help you, right? To just make all these kinds of safety conversations as common a part of church life as, the finance report or the mission report. Um, because transparency is one of those principles of trauma-informed care, right? If people can see what you're doing to keep them safe, they feel safer. And they are safer,
Mhm.
right? So that's my commitment. I actually have a new title, Nikki, and it includes church safety in the title. Director for Leadership Development, Abuse Prevention, and Church Safety, right? And
Nice.
and so I get to talk about this more and more.
Well,
My job
good.
didn't change that much, just the title did to reflect
Got
it.
it.
Bye, Camille. Come
Got
at
it.
you, hey. And Peter. All right.
Anything else?
I appreciate y'all hanging in here, having this conversation.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Thank
nobody's
you.
idea of a good time, but it does feel important.
Mhm. It does.
And and also, I say this too when I do abuse prevention training, typically is my demeanor is generally optimistic and pleasant, right? Like I tried to be a happy guy. Uh, and I can take on these hard conversations and do this work because it is hopeful for me,
Mhm.
right? Like I'm hopeful everybody's experience of church will be better and safer, and that women will be better and safer as they serve, right? Like, this is hopeful work for me. And so I'm happy to engage and talk about it any chance I get. So thank y'all for being a part of it.
And thanks for doing it for us. I appreciate it.
Heck yeah.
Yeah.
I'll send you the resources and things
Mhm.
tomorrow, Nikki.
All right, and then I'll get the recording and that out to everyone. Thank you
Sounds
for
great.
being here, everyone. And thank you,
Thank y'all.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
y'all. Bye.
Yeah.